Daniel Carter had spent most of his professional life in polished courtrooms and sleek law offices, but he never thought of himself as a man of grandeur. At 42, with streaks of silver in his hair and a quiet dignity about him, he valued peace over prestige. For years, he had worked as a real estate attorney, specializing in homeowner associations and property covenants. In fact, his name rested quietly at the bottom of legal documents across several suburban neighborhoods. He was good at his job, not because he liked power, but because he believed that communities should be places of respect and fairness, not tyranny. His philosophy was simple. Rules should protect people, not punish them. Recently, life had pushed him toward a quieter chapter. After a long divorce and years of juggling demanding clients, Daniel purchased a modest 2-story home in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. He was looking forward to slower mornings, gardening in the afternoons, and evenings on his porch with a good book. The house he bought was nothing extraordinary: beige siding, a small front lawn, a wooden fence enclosing the backyard. But to Daniel, it was freedom. He planted roses near the walkway, not in neat military rows but in a natural cluster that reminded him of his grandmother's garden. On his porch sat a weathered wooden bench, an heirloom from his father. To Daniel, these touches made the house a home. His neighbors greeted him politely at first. Some waved while walking their dogs. Others nodded as they drove past. Willow Creek had charm. Children playing on bikes, couples jogging in the mornings, and elderly residents tending their gardens. But beneath the surface, Daniel sensed something else, a stiffness, as if people measured their every move, worried about unseen eyes. It did not take long for him to understand why. The Homeowners Association. 2 weeks after settling in, Daniel found a crisp envelope in his mailbox with the HOA's logo stamped across the front. Inside was a formal violation notice. Dear Mr. Carter, you are in violation of Willow Creek HOA Covenant Section 14, Subsection B, regarding unauthorized exterior modifications. Your wooden bench, placed on your porch, is non-compliant. You are hereby instructed to remove it within 10 business days, or face a fine of $250. Daniel blinked at the letter and then chuckled softly. Of all things, the bench, the same bench he had placed on porches in every home he had lived in, was suddenly a crime. But what made the situation even more amusing, and slightly ironic, was that he was the one who had written Section 14. Subsection B, nearly a decade earlier when Willow Creek Estates was first built. He had drafted it with the intent of preventing residents from erecting large, unsightly structures, sheds, gazebos, above-ground pools, without approval. It was never meant to apply to a small piece of porch furniture. As he reread the letter, Daniel felt more bemused than offended. The HOA clearly had no idea who they were dealing with. Still, instead of firing back immediately, he decided to play it calm. Let us see where this goes, he muttered, folding the notice and slipping it into a folder where he kept personal documents. He had no idea then that this minor skirmish would escalate into a battle that would transform not just his life, but the entire neighborhood. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the violation notice lying flat before him. A cup of black coffee steamed at his side. He tapped the paper lightly with one finger, as though it were an old acquaintance playing a mischievous trick. This is not about a bench, he murmured to himself. This is about control. He could have written a letter immediately, citing the covenant's original intent and shutting down the HOA with a single paragraph of legal precision. But that was not Daniel's way. Instead, he drafted a polite email requesting a hearing before the board. Dear Mrs. Granger, I appreciate your diligence in maintaining the standards of Willow Creek Estates. I would like the opportunity to discuss this notice in person at the next HOA board meeting. I believe a clarification may be in order regarding Section 14. Respectfully, Daniel Carter. He clicked send and leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. He knew what was coming: arrogance, dismissal, and perhaps even hostility. But he also knew something the HOA did not: that he had written the very words they were trying to use against him. The response came swiftly. Mr. Carter, your presence at the upcoming board meeting is noted. However, please be advised that violation notices are not subject to debate. Compliance is expected. Regards, Margaret Granger, HOA President. Daniel shook his head, a quiet laugh escaping. Not subject to debate, he repeated. That is not how covenants work, Margaret. A week later, the board meeting was held in the community clubhouse. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where 5 board members sat, papers stacked neatly before them. At the center sat Mrs. Margaret Granger, a woman in her late 50s, immaculately dressed, her expression permanently set to disapproval. Daniel arrived early and took a seat near the front. Other residents shuffled in, whispering about minor disputes, lawn lengths, paint colors, parking infractions. Daniel listened, noting the nervous energy in the room. Everyone seemed afraid of stepping out of line when his name was called. Mrs. Granger did not smile. Mr. Carter, you've received a violation notice. Would you like to explain why you have chosen to ignore the covenants that everyone else abides by? Daniel clasped his hands calmly on the table before him. Mrs. Granger, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Section 14, subsection B, is being misapplied in this instance. Mrs. Granger's lips tightened. There is no misunderstanding. The rule is clear. Unauthorized exterior modifications are prohibited. With respect, Daniel replied evenly. The clause was intended for large structures or permanent alterations, not a small piece of porch furniture. The language itself reflects that. A board member to her right frowned. How would you know what the language reflects? Daniel smiled but did not answer directly. Let us just say I am very familiar with the intent of those covenants. Mrs. Granger leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Mr. Carter, the board has the authority to interpret the rules. Your bench is not compliant. Unless you remove it, we will proceed with fines. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the residents seated in the back. One whispered, "They fined me for my birdbath last year." Another muttered, "This is ridiculous." Daniel held up a folder he had carried in with him. Inside were the original covenant documents, drafted on his firm's letterhead years ago. He opened it deliberately, his fingers brushing the pages with a familiarity no one else in the room possessed. Interpretation, Daniel said slowly, has limits. Especially when the text itself provides guidance. You see, Section 14 was never meant to restrict harmless personal touches like benches or flower pots. The intent, as written, was to preserve the neighborhood's appearance without stifling individuality. Mrs. Granger's face flushed crimson. "And how would you know that?" she snapped. Daniel's eyes met hers steadily. "Because, Mrs. Granger, I am the lawyer who wrote these covenants." The room fell into stunned silence. Papers rustled. A man in the back let out an audible, "What?" Daniel laid the covenant copy flat on the table. The signatures at the bottom unmistakable. His own name was there in ink. "I know what these words mean," he said firmly, "because I put them there." For a moment, Mrs. Granger was speechless. Then she gathered herself, straightening her blazer. "Be that as it may, times have changed. The board has the right to adapt and enforce these rules as necessary for the good of the community." Daniel's expression softened, though his voice carried steel. "No, Mrs. Granger, the board has the right to enforce the rules, not rewrite them at will. There is a difference." Another board member, a younger man with glasses, cleared his throat. Nervously, perhaps. "We should," but Mrs. Granger cut him off. "This is not open for argument. Mr. Carter is exploiting a loophole, and I will not allow one resident to undermine community standards. If necessary, we will vote on further action, including fines and possible legal measures." Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. "Then I look forward to that vote. And the legal measures." The tension in the room was electric. Neighbors exchanged wide-eyed looks. Some nodded quietly at Daniel's calm defiance. Others shrank back, fearful of the conflict brewing. The morning after the board meeting, Daniel found another envelope taped to his front door. The paper was heavier this time, the tone sharper. "Notice of escalation. Due to your refusal to comply with HOA directives, the board has voted to impose an initial fine of $250, effective immediately. Continued noncompliance may result in legal action." Daniel sighed, folding the letter neatly and placing it into his folder of growing evidence. His resolve hardened. This was no longer about a bench. This was about principle. That evening, as he took his usual walk around the block, several neighbors stopped him. "Mr. Carter," whispered an elderly woman named Mrs. Hanley, clutching her cardigan, "thank you for standing up to them. They fined me for hanging a wind chime last summer. I paid because I was scared." A young father pushing a stroller chimed in. "They threatened to tow my car when I parked in my own driveway overnight. They said it looked cluttered." Daniel listened, nodding thoughtfully. Each story added fuel to the quiet rebellion forming in his mind. The HOA had not just overstepped. They had built their power on fear. Instead of removing his bench, Daniel spent the next week preparing a formal legal challenge. He drafted a letter on crisp stationery, citing misapplication of funds, improper enforcement, and breaches of fiduciary duty. The letter was not aggressive, but precise. A scalpel, not a sword. He sent copies to the HOA board, the property management company, and most importantly, to every homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors stopped Daniel on the sidewalks, thanking him. Some even slipped notes into his mailbox. "Finally, someone is standing up for us." At the next board meeting, the turnout was unlike anything the HOA had seen before. Usually, only a handful of residents came. This time, the clubhouse was packed. People stood along the walls, murmuring with anticipation. Daniel arrived calmly, carrying the same folder of documents. He nodded politely at his neighbors, many of whom now greeted him with open respect. Mrs. Granger, however, looked rattled. Her usually perfect composure cracked as she shuffled her papers. Clearly aware that the tide was turning, the meeting began stiffly, with Mrs. Granger attempting to assert authority. This meeting is called to address Mr. Carter's continued non-compliance. The board has voted to uphold the fines, and further escalation is pending. Before she could continue, a voice from the crowd shouted, "Let him speak." Another added, "We want to hear his side." Mrs. Granger's jaw tightened. Reluctantly, she gestured for Daniel to step forward. Daniel placed his folder on the table and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that silenced the murmurs. "Friends, I did not come here to cause trouble. I came here because I believe in community, in fairness, in respect, in cooperation. That is why, years ago, I drafted the very covenants this board claims to enforce. My intent was simple: to protect property values without strangling individuality." He held up a page from the covenant document, the original text visible to all. This clause, Section 14, was written to prevent unsightly, permanent structures from disrupting the neighborhood's character. It was never intended to outlaw benches, flower pots, or bird baths. Yet this board has chosen to twist its meaning to control every detail of your lives. Gasps and nods rippled through the crowd. Daniel's voice grew stronger. "And it is not just my bench. Many of you have been fined unfairly. Many of you have lived in fear of small petty infractions. That is not community. That is tyranny." Mrs. Granger slammed her palm on the table. "Order. This is outrageous. The board has full authority." "No," Daniel interrupted, his tone sharp but steady. "The board has a fiduciary duty to enforce the covenants faithfully, not to reinterpret them for personal power. When you misuse that authority, you break trust. And trust is the foundation of every community." The room erupted in applause. Neighbors who had once sat quietly now cheered, their voices rising in support. Mrs. Granger's face turned crimson. "You cannot incite rebellion against this board." "I am not inciting rebellion," Daniel replied firmly. "I am asking for accountability, and the law is on my side. If necessary, I will file suit not just for myself, but on behalf of every homeowner who has been wrongfully fined." The younger board member with glasses, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice trembled slightly, but his words carried weight. "Mrs. Granger, perhaps it is time we reconsider. The residents clearly feel unheard. Maybe we should hold a vote." The room erupted again with cheers and applause. Neighbors shouted, "Vote her out. We need change." Mrs. Granger stood rigid, refusing to yield. But the tide had turned. The residents demanded a special election to replace the board, and under pressure, the other members reluctantly agreed. Daniel did not gloat. Instead, he simply closed his folder and said quietly, "This was never about me. It was about all of us." The special election was held 2 weeks later, in the same clubhouse where Mrs. Granger had once presided with iron authority. This time, the atmosphere was different. Gone was the nervous silence that had once filled the room. In its place was a hum of anticipation, neighbors chatting freely, exchanging smiles, and even laughter. Mrs. Granger entered late, her usual air of superiority dimmed. She avoided eye contact, clutching her binder as if it might shield her from the glares and whispers around her. When the votes were tallied, the results were clear. The residents had overwhelmingly chosen new board members, people known for fairness, approachability, and a willingness to listen. Mrs. Granger and her allies were out, for the first time in years. Neighbors applauded not out of obligation, but out of genuine relief. Mrs. Granger left without a word, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. Daniel watched her go, not with triumph, but with quiet reflection. He knew the sting of defeat, and though her pride had brought her downfall, he felt a measure of pity. Power, he thought, was a fragile thing when built on fear. The new board's first act was to retract Daniel's violation notice and cancel all fines associated with it. But they did not stop there. They invited Daniel to assist in reviewing and revising the covenants to ensure clarity and fairness. He accepted not as a board member, but as a neighbor. On a Saturday afternoon, Daniel sat in the clubhouse with a group of residents, papers spread across the tables. Instead of legal jargon and intimidation, there was laughter, discussion, and collaboration. Parents suggested allowances for children's play equipment. Gardeners asked for freedom to plant more flowers. Retirees requested leniency for small decorative items. Daniel guided them with a steady hand, ensuring that the rules protected property values, but also celebrated individuality. He reminded them often, rules should serve the people, not the other way around. For the first time in years, Willow Creek Estates felt alive. Children hung colorful wind spinners on porches without fear of fines. Neighbors stopped to chat instead of hurrying inside to avoid scrutiny. The spirit of community, once strangled by the HOA's heavy hand, bloomed again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Daniel sat on his porch bench, the same bench that had sparked the entire battle. A light breeze rustled the roses at his feet. Across the street, Mrs. Hanley waved as she hung a small bird feeder on her porch. Smiling freely, Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He had never wanted a fight. All he had wanted was peace, a quiet place to begin again. Yet life had nudged him into battle, and through it, something greater had emerged. He thought of his years in courtrooms, of contracts and clauses and heated disputes. Those had been victories of law. But this was a victory of heart. His phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. "Thank you for standing up for us. You changed everything." Daniel smiled, setting the phone aside. He looked out at the neighborhood, children laughing, families gathering, flowers blooming without fear of reprimand, and felt a deep, satisfying calm. The law, he realized, was not just ink on paper. It was a shield. And sometimes, it was a light that guided people back to fairness, back to trust, back to each other. And so, on his quiet porch, on his sturdy old bench, Daniel Carter finally found the peace he had been seeking all along.